Well,
Carol.
hi, Sharon. It's been fun talking lately about this and the interview. And so we go back to 1979, I think.
I think it's 1980. I finished grad school in 79 in University of New Mexico, and then I came to UC Berkeley in the summer of 1980.
Okay, so that's quite a history, math-wise, over 40 years now. Um, and I've always been so drawn to you and your work and the way you are in the world. I liked you when I first met you. And I've just, I think in the beginning we just knew each other as artists, not as activists or not as people working in the community. So, and I'm curious because I didn't have any of that background um, about you. What were the early influences on your artwork at that time?
The early influences on my artwork was a really kind of powerful male art teacher at Tyler School of Art. His name was Richard Kramer, and he's a colorist, and he works with a grid. And he worked with the grid in a really interesting way. He was really interested in iridescence, and he was trying to recreate the iridescence in birds and the structures that for creating iridescence. If you look at them microscopically, there's a grid where the grid's kind of tilted up. So each cell of the grid is not flat; it's tilted up, and it kind of holds on to the light in a specific way. He was doing that with his paint. He was making these humongous paintings, and he was a great guy. He was very charismatic, and students loved him. He died of COVID this past year. And anyway, he was a Tyler School of Art. And so I ended up as a painter taking classes from him. He had a huge influence. Most of the students who worked with him worked abstractly. I ended up working with a grid. I worked with a grid for a few years and was really interested in color interaction. And then feminism stepped in. This is in the early 70s, and I became more interested in the grid as like a structure that could be used for things like weaving and fabric. And so instead of making these hard edge grids, I started tearing the canvas up that I would paint and then weaving it back together. So I was making these grids, but the grids were actually physically woven and stretched over, you know, um, panels, stretched over stretchers, the way you would, make a painting. And so anyway, and I was interested in multiples in that I would make lots of little ones and put them together to make a bigger one. And the colors would interact, and there was this texture, and the texture was, the texture of fabric being woven together. So that was probably, a big influence, like working with Richard Kramer and then working against him, in a way, like, taking that hard edge color field painting into something that was more like weaving, more like sculpture, more textural, yeah, more feminine.
Is that, I know you went from there to UNM, to the University of New Mexico, MA program in art. Were there certain teachers there or what drew you
No,
best?
there wasn't many women, and what happened at University of New Mexico is almost all of the students were women, and pretty much all of the faculty were men, except for one that I worked with who was in the photography program. Her name was Betty Hahn, and she was an artist who printed really early gum prints on fabric, and then she would go back in and sew in the fabric. And I loved her work, and she was very supportive of my work. So she was the head of my thesis committee there, and mostly everyone else was a man. I can't even remember some of the names of them, but I didn't have a lot of interaction with them. We all had studios there, and I worked a lot with this idea of weaving and paint, acrylic paint on canvas woven back together in a lot of different ways. And by the end of my graduate time there, and right after graduation, I started taking the weaving off the wall, and it was more on the floor and on structures that were like sculptural structures that were more freestanding. Yeah, but they still were made the same way. They were just, the whole idea of having them just on a wall seemed really limiting.
That's the work I remember you making when we met then in 1980.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I have a question. It just makes me think of something when you were talking about tearing and reweaving, the idea of repair and i.e. healing. Was that something in your mind at the time or just something you were doing or?
By the time I was at UC Berkeley when we met in 1980, yes, almost all the work had the genesis of the work. The idea for the pieces came from some social issues really um, that I really responded to. One was the election of Ronald Reagan. Another was the murder of John Lennon. So those are the pieces that were in my graduate show, and they were all about tearing apart, putting back together, kind of some kind of a memory and memorial. But not unlike in retrospect the tearing of when Jews are in mourning, you you show the tearing of your heart by tearing clothing. And they're not unlike that. I mean, I started realizing over time all these connections. But sometimes we don't. We grow up with things and we see things and we don't realize how much they influence us till later. So yeah, good question around healing and repair. I think those are two really um, big motivators in my work and ideas that I work with a lot.
I see that in your work and in your life and the way the projects you do in the community. It's all to me, seems in a way about art as healing and just people connecting can be healing. So, so when you came to Berkeley then, um, was it 1 or 2 years you were in the graduate program for the?
Just a full year, actually. Yeah. Because I had done 2 years at University of New Mexico, and UC Berkeley was one of the few schools, along with Chicago Art Institute, that would transfer all 36 of the graduate credits I did, and I applied to a bunch of different schools. And I decided I wouldn't transfer to any that didn't transfer all of my already 36 completed graduate credits. So UC Berkeley was one, and the Art Institute. And at the time in New Mexico, I was working in a feminist cafe, and I asked one of the people who ran the cafe, what should I do? Should I go to Chicago? Should I go to Berkeley? And she looked down at my feet. I always wore Birkenstocks, and she said, "You can't wear those in Chicago, Sharon. You need to go to Berkeley." So I did.
The lucky things that happen for sure. I love that. So do you still wear Birkenstock, Sharon?
I do, yeah. when it's warm out. Right now, I'm wearing rubber rain boots to walk out to the studio because it was pouring when I came out.
Yeah. So what were the influences or the people you met that just, although it was just a year, that took off in your work for the future from your year at UC Berkeley?
I think meeting Joan Brown was a big deal. I really loved how supportive she was of women artists and her women students. For example, I knew that I had to write another thesis and she told me, you have to write a thesis to graduate with an MFA from Berkeley. There was a written document, and I said that I had just written one. I just finished one like this past year. And she said, "Oh, bring it in." And she read it and she said, "This'll do. You don't need to write it. Just make your work," which was lovely. And so I was making my work in the basement of a house I was renting, a group house in Oakland. was making it. And I didn't have to write any more papers. So that was lovely. Yeah. So, but it was just a year, and I think more the influence was from outside the arts. I was really involved with activism, and as soon as I moved to Berkeley, I had been doing work around ocean ecology and working with Greenpeace and an organization called General Whale that was a kind of save the whale organization. And we started one on UC Berkeley's campus, and it's how I met some of my friends who are long-term friends who are in lots of different fields who were environmental activists. And so yeah, started this organization on campus. So I was meeting people who wanted to do work around the environment.
I know you have always been known in the Bay Area for your work in the AIDS community, mostly, as far as I know, with collaborative projects, art projects, teaching classes in residential communities, etc. So where does that fit in your art?
I appreciate your line of questioning. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm seeing the line now, from that question you just asked about healing and repair to reading the newspaper. So after grad school, I just worked in a restaurant collective with a bunch of other artists, and I was making my work. And it was at UC Berkeley's art museum called the Swallow. It was one of the spin-offs from the Cheese Board, and worked with a bunch of artists. But I started reading more and more about the AIDS, what turned out to be the AIDS pandemic, the AIDS epidemic at the time, and how it was affecting a lot of artists in particular in the Bay Area and New York. And I heard about these things called California Arts Council Artist in Residence Grants. And I wanted to figure out a way that was healing and helpful and repairing to help artists who were living with AIDS. So I wrote a grant proposal. I'd never done anything like that before. I don't know what I was thinking, to the California Arts Council in 1987. And yeah, that I got funded, and that was the beginning of work that started in '88, the fall of '88, that is still ongoing, to now, to 2021. I'm still working in that community, but with some long-term survivors who I've known since those first early days, who did survive. Not a lot did, but some did. So yeah, and the other thing was that I became really interested in the effects that UC Berkeley and my paying back my student loan was having on the larger global community. And I found out that UC Berkeley was funding Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is where they sign nuclear weapons for the whole country. And it's 30 miles from Berkeley and Livermore. And so I got really involved with the Livermore Action Group in the early 80s. Did a lot of nonviolent civil disobedience at the lab, and joined together with a group of artists they called ourselves BAND, Bay Area Artists for Nuclear Disarmament. And then I made a lot of artwork that was about that work, about civil disobedience. Like we're very respectful to the police who were arresting us, and we wore armbands letting them know if we were the ones who wanted to be arrested, or if we were press, or if we were medics. And so I sometimes would collect armbands after a demonstration, and they were getting woven back into a lot of the big pieces I was making. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful integration of your life, your values, and then sharing it with others through the artwork.
Well,
and
I think all of us as artists, like to kind of merge life and art. I mean, I think for me, that's always the key, is to figure out where everything's connected and intersects, and not have to have my political work here, my social justice work here, whatever, environmental work, and then have my art here, and then have the rest of my life there. But like, how does that all become one thing? I mean, the better we can do that, I think the happier we are, and the more effective the work is.
I think that's somewhat unusual, though. I think there are a lot of people for whom it's compartmentalized,
Yeah,
and the work is less connected to, you know, social justice or contemporary issues. It could be like you're talking about the color grid, you know, more abstract issues or less personal.
yeah.
And the way you integrate it makes your work have a you know, a depth and a vitality that,
Well, I think you and I share that. That's probably why I like you so much and why we've been friends for a long time. I think that, when we switch roles and ask you questions, I think you're going to find that there's a lot of similarities. Yeah.
yeah, what is some of the pieces that, like you talked about the armbands, are there other works, say from, I mean, I remember you organizing exhibits when we were at Nexus, and then you have an annual exhibit of, I'm not sure where you were teaching, of artists with AIDS and all the artwork.
Yeah.
Incredible
So
exhibit.
those were some of the sites where I was doing my artist in residence project with California Arts Council. So it was at Rec Stop Support Center in San Francisco, which is an organization run by people with AIDS, for people with AIDS, with paid staff, and the Center for AIDS Services in Oakland. It was a new organization that was like a day drop-in center for people with AIDS. And then I was actually soon after that working with Arts and Corrections and through William James, and was working specifically with people at Vacaville who were HIV positive, who were either in the hospice, the AIDS hospice, or in a C wing, which was a wing for people who had tested positive for HIV. So I was working with those folks. So I was able to bring out some of that work to put it in the exhibit. So there was a couple of years where there was work from those three communities: East Bay, San Francisco, and yeah. And but that was like really a platform for their work. I mean, I think I made work that was in response to that, but I never really showed my work with them until later when we were doing, that project, which is called Positive Art. That project of working in community with people who have AIDS, became more like collaborative in a real more traditional sense. And then there were artists in that project that were really skilled, that I ended up doing more closely collaborative public art pieces with, and or exhibits where we would bring it to Butte College in Chico, and do a series of panels and have the work there. Just to use the work as a departure point to start talking about AIDS. Because still now, but even in the 80s and 90s, there was so much misinformation and fear, from people who didn't know someone who had AIDS. So just to use the artwork as a departure point. One of the things we did at Nexus was we invited youth alternative projects. I think what they're called in West Berkeley. Mostly serves young people in the summer who were called at risk, underserved youth. And we invited them to our exhibit at Nexus, and then we artists who were in the exhibit who were all living with AIDS walked around and talked about their work. And the young people sat in chairs in the center and asked questions. And they would ask questions like, "Well, you're working with blood in your work," they said to John Nielsen. Could I get it? I'll touch your work. Could I get AIDS? So John could explain, no, you can't, and why. Yeah. We were doing, HIV positive artists were doing AIDS education to the people who are most at risk, young people, through talking about their art, which was really a safe way to talk about it.
that's beautiful. There's something this brings up for me, that by you hosting those exhibits, organizing them, the educational opportunities where you're not even the presenter, but you're just facilitating. On some level, I see that as social practice art, or, you're involving, it's not you, it's not your words, it's not your art, and yet you're creating this situation.
Yeah, I think it's not unlike what you're doing in San Quentin. I think that part of our work, and I consider it my work too, part of our work is creating safe spaces, public forums for like democracy, basically, for
Mm.
people's voices to be heard who wouldn't normally be heard by certain audiences. So we're bringing, what we see, the communities we're working in, we're bringing what we see and have the privilege to be part of to like, larger public forums so that, people can just learn from the folks that we work with who there's so much to learn from, right? Yeah.
There's such a beauty to that because it's just amplifies the voice. You might be behind that, but then this person talks and reaches this person, and it isn't just our work on the wall or something. It's not whether it's a beautiful piece or a beautiful installation and experience for people, but it just brings it out so far,
Yeah.
and it's not focused on you, but you're the
Yeah.
big piece of the energy, the wave behind that. And I think that's a beautiful legacy too. And you're still teaching so much. You're such a wonderful educator.
Well, I feel like, just the way life and art can intersect, I feel like also the teaching can be like that, and you probably agree, probably any teaching you've done is really connected to, all these things we're talking about. So, the classes that where my heart are is in is like, the Eco Art Matters class that I co-teach with Andre, Singer Thompson, and the Artist of Citizen class I've taught for years, in collaboration with Richard Kamler, Pamela Blotner years ago at the Art Institute, Claudia Bernardi. I've taught it in collaboration with so many people, and teaching it alone at PCT now. It's you know, using okay, so you and I didn't learn this at UC Berkeley, and we didn't learn these skills. We taught ourselves. So we're older, we're older experts in the field. We're kind of the legacy experts in the field of this kind of community engaged social justice work, like how artists can engage in that way. And I think it's really important to teach younger people about it. So that's where my heart is. Like, and it's part of my artwork is to just make sure that young people realize that their art can be something beautiful that hangs on people's walls, but their art can also be engaged in communities, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. And they can bring their skills to communities, and those communities can thrive because they engage with those communities. So that's what the classes are about. A lot of, and that's I would continue doing that till I just can't teach anymore because I think it's important. I think it's important for democracy actually, and it's important for art. Yeah.
Well, it's beautiful what you do. And I just, every time I visit your class or you've brought your classes to San Quentin, to the art studio, the questions your students have and the insight and the openness that they have to talking with the guys inside, listening, they listen. You're really teaching some deep values.
I think it's not. I think it's those kinds of people, those kinds of students are attracted to this kind of work.
Mm.
I think they already came with a lot of those really beautiful interpersonal skills, and that's why they wanted to take a class like that. So I adore those kind of students that they're already asking questions about, like, what is art for? Who is art for? Like they ask questions about equity and about social responsibility, and they have talent. So I love those students.
Do you, besides your many, many ways of working in community, teaching, I'm seeing work on the wall behind you. What are some of do you have any like self-nurturing or, work you get to make now or in the past year or so?
Yeah. So most of my artwork is really just engaged in my own fears and neuroses and passions. So I have, like all of us who have any kind of sensitivity. My fears about climate crisis, so a lot of the work around the studio is work that I've been doing, this text work burnt into maps. And it's, I have a grant from the City of Berkeley Civic Arts Commission to do an engaged project and haven't been able to do it because of COVID. I bought a white lab coat and I've got an old clipboard and I have a list of questions where I'm asking people about, what they notice about things around them changing and what their feelings are about it. It's more like the psychological effects of climate crisis and of ecological collapse. So, and I wanted to ask homeless people, and I wanted to ask people who work for the city government, and all kinds of people who work and live in Berkeley. And I started off just doing it by email with friends who work and live in Berkeley. I'm just having it Berkeley specific, which is why you haven't gotten an email from me about it, because it's overwhelming to me, and because we were supposed to be serving Berkeley with this money, this small amount of money. So I'm keeping it. So I'm burning in some old maps of Berkeley. The words of people's fears about climate. And the idea is to finally put the work out in public somewhere, like maybe DMVs or, places where people hang out for a long time, Social Security office, and they can actually see these maps of old maps of Berkeley, but they can read burnt text in it. It's like about people's feelings, about how they're feeling right now, living in Berkeley or working in Berkeley, because they see these changes going on around them, in the climate, in the land, in the amount of birds they're seeing, all that kind of stuff. So that people don't feel alone, because I think a lot of people are suffering from ecological, ecological grief. And I actually have been reading a little bit about ecological grief. There's some scientists that are studying it. And so I think a lot of people are walking around with it and they don't talk about it to each other. So I wanted to use the artwork as this forum to, have a conversation, or at least for you to feel like you're not alone, because when you read somebody else's grief and fears about that. So, and then another project I'm working on, and I have to go over to Kala to do that. And I'm collaborating with one of the long-term survivors I've been working with since the 80s. Her name's Nancy Lemoyne. She's a fabulous printmaker. So she's teaching me printmaking over at Kala. We go in with masks, we work at a distance, and we make an appointment, and we're often the only people in Kala. Sometimes there's staff or something like that. We go on some Wednesdays and some Saturdays when Nancy's feeling up to it, because Nancy has a real roller coaster with her health. She gets sick a lot. She has she has AIDS. She's had AIDS since 1987. So she is teaching me printmaking. We're doing what kind of experimental one-of-a-kind photo silk screens, and they're based in stories from the long-term survivors that we work with. The project is focused on the love that they give back to community. So it's called Service Work, and it's about how people who are living in AIDS housing and on SSI and in kind of long-term care are also giving back to community in ways that are so under the radar, that they do these amazing things for each other. They, work for Food Not Bombs, or one guy who really influenced the project sends all the money that he gets to his family in India. He's an older African-American gay man named Ben Simmons. He's 78. He sends his money to this young family in India that he met the father when he was traveling in India before he tested positive. And he puts these kids through schools he never met. And he has his kitchen is filled with pictures of his Indian family, and he sends them money all the time. So I love his stories. And so we're starting with Ben's image. Before COVID hit, we took photographs. The idea was to take photographs of 12 people in the building who wanted to work with us and to pay them, and then do interviews with them. So we've done the photography and the interview with Ben. We interviewed Ben after COVID outdoors. And so we're using some of his stories and words interspersed with his image, and really making the image very artsy, kind of in the style of, the Obama Hope poster, but even more like kind of like the text on it and just hand work in color. And to like really raise public and people can just see, what people who are long-term survivors of AIDS living on government assistance give back to the community.
Sharon, that's so beautiful. I love that you're just working and working, continuing to work and share voices. And I can't wait to see this project.
Yeah, I can't either. It's going to take forever because the timeline already ended. We
Yeah.
got a Creative Works Fund grant for that, and the timeline ended, and I just had to rewrite the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding with the organization, and we decided that the timeline begins as soon as it's safe for us to enter the building again, which is, when everybody's vaccinated, and who knows when that's going to be. So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we've probably gone over, and I'm sorry about that. So
We
maybe
can go on.
okay, I'm going to turn off the. Anyway, this has been great, Carol. Thank you, and I look forward to interviewing you.
Thanks. This is wonderful.
Yes. Um, I have to find a little recording for it.